You ever wonder how medieval knights could swing heavy swords all day, ride horses for hours, and still look like they had energy left to wrestle a bear? Turns out it wasn't just about how they trained. A big part of it came from what they ate, and one grain in particular played a major role in all of it. Funny thing is, hardly anyone eats it anymore. Barley. That humble little grain that somehow got left in the dust while wheat strutted its way into every kitchen in the modern world. Back in the day though, barley was king. Not some backup plan, not filler, it was the main act. The grain that kept peasants and royalty alike going strong through hard winters, brutal work and long battles. It wasn't just food, it was fuel, and unlike wheat, which basically throws a fit every time the weather acts up, barley just keeps growing. Rain, fine. Drought, no problem. Bad soil, barley shrugs and says, "I've seen worse." It's the kind of crop that medieval farmers could count on. And count on it they did, for bread, for porridge, for brewing ale. This stuff fed their animals too, one crop covering all bases. Total workhorse. But there was a reason barley slowly disappeared from bakeries. Ever try baking with it? Barley flour doesn't exactly give you light, fluffy loaves. It's got gluten but not much. The bread it makes comes out dense, chewy, kind of like if you mixed a brick with a sponge. Medieval bakers did what they could. They'd mix in some wheat, if they had it. But let's be honest, no one was lining up for barley ciabatta. It wasn't pretty, but it filled you up and kept you alive. And it's ancient. Barley goes back more than 10,000 years. That's older than written language in most parts of the world. While our ancestors were still trying to figure out how to stop tripping over their own spears, barley was already on the dinner table. During the medieval era, entire societies depended on it. Harvest celebrations were built around it. And don't even get me started on the beer. Barley beer was practically a religion. These days though, barley's barely a blip. Wheat took over everything. It's easier to mill, makes lighter bread, and people prefer that soft texture. So barley got shoved aside even though it's better for you in just about every way. More fiber, more minerals, steadier energy. But hey, who needs that when your sandwich bread looks good on Instagram? And barley wasn't alone in this fall from grace. Another quiet hero was doing just as much work in the background, oats. Especially up north, where winter laughs in your face and summer shows up late and leaves early. In places like Scotland and parts of Scandinavia, oats were the real MVP. They didn't need fancy soil or babying, just throw some seeds in the ground and bam, food. Scottish folks especially turned oats into an art. Porridge that could stop a sword, oat cakes tough enough to patch holes in your wall if needed, but they worked, thick, hearty and packed with everything a hard-living person needed. High in protein, full of fiber, good fats, these meals kept people going when the days were short and cold enough to freeze your eyelashes. Romans mocked oats, called it horse food. Later on, Samuel Johnson, the dictionary guy, joked that oats were only fit for English horses and Scottish people. To which the Scots supposedly said, "That's why England has the best horses and Scotland has the best men." Honestly, fair comeback. Modern science backs them up. Oats have something called beta-glucan, which helps lower cholesterol. Medieval farmers had no idea what that was, but they sure knew oats made them feel strong. The crops were also easy to harvest, even in soil that made other grains give up. And interestingly, the way oats were processed, roasting the grain to loosen the hulls, not only made them last longer, but gave them better flavor. That little extra step actually made them tastier. So why aren't we all still eating oat-based everything? Because they couldn't make the kind of fluffy bread that became trendy. No gluten structure, no rye. As wheat got cheaper and easier to grow, oats ended up in the barn with the horses and later in our breakfast bowls. Meanwhile, medieval warriors were out there running on oat porridge and zero-protein shake. But if oats were the loyal old friend of medieval grains, rye was the scrappy survivor who didn't care if you liked him or not. Rye grew where other grains wouldn't even try. Soil that looked like gravel. Rye's fine. Snow one day, drought the next. Rye's still here. Farmers in cold, harsh places like Russia, Poland and Germany leaned on rye like it was a trusted old tool. It just worked. The bread that came from rye wasn't delicate. This stuff was dense, dark and heavy. A slice of rye could feed you for hours. It didn't look pretty, didn't rise high, and definitely didn't win any fluff awards. But it had calories, minerals, and enough bulk to keep people alive when nothing else would grow. Rye was the grain for the tough times, the lean years, the places other crops abandoned. And it was cheap. That mattered. Rich folks might show off with wheat bread on holidays, but everyday people stuck with rye. It was reliable, filling, and didn't complain. Grinding it was hard. Rye wasn't gentle on old milling stones, and baking with it took skill. It didn't behave like wheat, and you had to know how to work with it. But for those who did, it was gold. Ironically, rye got pushed out just like barley and oats. As people got more into soft white bread and commercial baking, rye's dark, hearty loaves looked outdated. But now, health-conscious folks are bringing it back. Funny how that works. And there was one more grain playing the survival game better than most: millet. Millet's that friend who always shows up when you need help moving but never asks for credit. It grows fast, like really fast. 60 to 90 days from planting to harvest, that's unheard of. And it doesn't care where you plant it. Drought? Millet's cool, awful soil, still good. Farmers in medieval Europe didn't throw millet fancy parties, but they definitely planted it when things got rough. Millet didn't look or taste like wheat. It had a nuttier flavor, a different texture. It worked better as porridge or flatbread than anything fluffy. But it filled bellies, delivered protein, and kept people from starving. That's not nothing. People in Asia and Africa still use millet all the time. But in the West, most people think it's bird food. Which is hilarious because our ancestors used it to survive winter after brutal winter. They even figured out how to make it taste good with the right herbs and pairings. But like the others, millet got left behind when easier, flashier grains became available. If millet was the backup dancer that saved the show more times than anyone admitted, then spelt was the grain that deserved a standing ovation but rarely got one. People often confused it for wheat, and for good reason. It looked a lot like it, but once you bit into it, you knew you were eating something else. Spelt bread had this nutty, bold flavor that made regular wheat taste like air by comparison. Medieval farmers loved spelt. It wasn't because it was trendy, they didn't care about. They loved it because it actually grew. Poor soil, no problem. A bit of a late frost, spelt would still show up. It didn't complain like wheat. You planted it and it gave you food. The yields weren't enormous, but the quality was solid. Nutritionally, spelt was stacked. More protein than wheat, better fiber, more minerals. Medieval folks didn't count calories or read nutrition labels, but they knew what food kept them full and strong. And spelt did the job. It had that kind of slow burn energy that kept you working all day without crashing. Farmers, soldiers, laborers, spelt bread helped them push through hard days without snacks every hour. And it wasn't just peasant food either. Spelt was special, not quite royal, but it had a reputation. The kind of bread made with it wasn't light and fluffy. It was dense, chewy, and satisfying. One slice was enough to keep you going. It felt like a proper meal, not a side dish. In a way, it was the sourdough of the medieval world, hearty, artisan style, the kind of thing you'd be proud to serve when guests came by. But there was one big downside. Spelt was annoying to process. The hulls clung to the grain like it was their life's purpose. Removing them was slow, frustrating work. You needed special equipment or a lot of patience, both hard to come by when you're already working 16-hour days on a medieval farm. So, when easier to process wheat became more available, spelt quietly got pushed out of the spotlight. Still, it never really vanished. The Romans were obsessed with it. They used spelt in religious rituals and even buried it with their dead. Clearly they thought it was a grain worth taking to the afterlife. Roman soldiers marched on spelt porridge, covering insane distances with only that and some dried meat. If you can power an army across Europe on it, it's probably not bad. Funny enough, spelt's having a comeback now. Artisan bakers and health-conscious folks are rediscovering it like it's some new superfood. Except it's not new at all. We just forgot about it. Now people pay extra for loaves made from spelt, the same grain that fed medieval farmers when times were rough. The irony's pretty thick. But the story doesn't stop there, because long before spelt made its name, there was another grain that quietly laid the foundation for everything: emmer. This ancient grain was one of the very first to be cultivated by humans. We're talking over 10,000 years ago. Before organized farming even had a name, people were already growing emmer in the Fertile Crescent. If food had a grandparent, it was this stuff. And it wasn't just old, it was tough. Emmer could handle wild weather swings, poor soil, and dry climate. It didn't care what the forecast was. It just kept growing. That kind of consistency meant everything to early civilizations. Egyptian pharaohs were so into emmer, they buried it with themselves so they could eat well in the next life. You don't get that kind of send-off unless you've done something important. Flavor-wise, emmer had a rich, almost nutty taste. Bakers used it for thick breads and porridge that stuck with you for hours. It was serious food, no fluff, no filler, the kind of thing that made you feel like you ate something real. And considering how hard medieval life could be, that mattered a lot. But like the others, emmer had a problem. Its protective hulls were hard to remove. Each grain had to be hulled with real effort. It was like trying to open walnuts all day just to make a single meal. Back when people had more time and fewer choices, they made it work. But once faster, easier grains showed up, emmer started to fade. Too much work, too slow to process. Still, it left its mark. Civilizations were literally built on it. Ancient Mesopotamia, emmer-powered. The pyramids, fed by emmer fields. Now, thousands of years later, it's showing up again in fancy restaurants and health food stores. People who care about flavor and nutrients are realizing emmer's been the secret weapon all along, and they're willing to pay extra to bring it back. And then there's einkorn, the grain that started it all. Before wheat became the global superpower of food, einkorn was the first, the OG, the one early farmer looked at and said, "Yep, we can grow this." With just 14 chromosomes compared to modern wheat's 42. Einkorn was as simple as it gets, but sometimes simple is exactly what works best. It had a sweet, nutty flavor that hit different. It didn't rise much and it was a pain to hull, but people kept growing it because it made them feel good. It didn't upset stomachs the way modern wheat sometimes does. Maybe because we ate it for thousands of years and our bodies just understood it. In places with rocky hills and tough soil, einkorn kept showing up and providing food when everything else quit. Even though it didn't yield much per acre, it never stopped being reliable. Farmers eventually traded it in for wheat that grew faster and more abundantly. But they didn't do it because einkorn was bad. They did it because modern farming became obsessed with volume. More yield per acre meant more profit. So einkorn got shoved to the side, but not forgotten. Like emmer, einkorn is making a return. People who care about real food, about flavor and digestion and history, are bringing it back. Artisan bakers are using it in crusty loaves, chefs are turning it into pasta, and nutritionists are loving the low gluten levels and rich nutrition. It's not cheap, but then again, neither is knowing where your food comes from. What's wild is that after thousands of years of progress, we're circling back to the very grains we left behind. The ones that fed knights, farmers, warriors, and kings. The ones that survived droughts, plagues, wars, and famines. They weren't fluffy, but they worked. Barley, oats, rye, millet, spelt, emmer, einkorn. These grains built history, not just as food, but as tools of survival. They fed generations before us and are quietly waiting in the background while we relearn how to eat. Not just for taste or trend, but to feel good, to last longer, to eat like someone who needs their food to do more than fill a plate. The truth is, we didn't outgrow these grains. We just got distracted, but they're still here, growing in forgotten fields, popping up in seed banks, getting rediscovered by bakers and farmers who are starting to ask the same question: why did we ever stop eating this way?